Now we will finish our morning session at lunchtime already by, and I hope I express the name now really, Nataša Petrešin Bachelez. Yeah, okay. She is, since this conference is on the one hand about heavy archival theory and photographic analysis on the one hand, but on archival and photographic archival practice on the other hand, it's very good that we now finally, for our final session, morning session, we have you to talk, a real art critic and curator. You maybe ground us by your experience, and as you can read from her biography, you have curated a couple of exhibitions, and some of you will know your writings from several art magazines. And now we look forward to your sort of critical view as an art critic on all the theories we have heard.
First of all, thank you very much to the organizers, to Krzysztof, to invite me in this highly intriguing and highly respected panels around these very important topics that touch the archive as project, and I might represent a kind of rupture in this very alchemically curated panel, the first panel, because I am a curator. So I will relate to John Tagg and say that I will represent the inert curatorial language, as well as link myself to what we heard today from Sven about the transmission, and it was also great to listen to Helen just right now about the memory image and the dialectical image. I will very unethically speak about my exhibition, but it's only a case study in order to address the notion, or let's say the relationship between a document and an artwork, and how the archive, I will also just spend a little bit of time of going into how the archive has become also a crucial curatorial question, and a space and time for curators to deal with the representations of archive in the exhibitions. So I will discuss more in details about document and its so-called performative potential. And as I said, I will relate to the exhibition that happened in Centre Pompidou in 2010. A historic accompanying document of an artwork in the exhibitions provides augmented visual access to an affirmative representation of that artwork, and on some occasions is the only trace that is left to constitute that artwork as such. The need to document, if I quote the publication that came out in 2005, this need to document and the desire to see and be persuaded by the reality, the authenticity of the document that it is revealing, has become the object of enormous attention in the recent theories and practices of exhibition making and museum studies. No longer arising only from the artist's engagement with the archival methods of classification and presentation. For example, we've seen in the first slide of John Tagg all the covers of the catalogs like Okwe Envezor's Archive Fever, uses of the document in contemporary art, or for example, there was another image of Charles Meriwether's compilation called The Archive. It is no longer just that artistic engagement whose outcome is often a certain politics of the truth, so a certain reclaiming of the truth, or a certain contextualization as what was called in curatorial language, the pedagogical aesthetics. So we could have seen in the latest in the last decade, for example, a lot of exhibitions that took place had their display done as a kind of seminar rooms with a lot of documents and books presented in order to be accessed, processed, and looked at. So this is not, as I said before, it's not only coming from the artist's engagement, but also can be observed in many art institutions and museums today. So I will look more closely just as a case study, not as a appraisal or any sort of elegy. The contextual part of the exhibition, The Promises of the Past, which I curated, in order to evoke the idea what a living archive could be, a living archive that represents an emerging discourse. In that case, it was a discourse about the former Eastern Europe, specifically in Paris, in France, where the last decades of the art coming from that region has been hugely neglected or just very sporadically been touched upon. And by assessing the notion of a performative document, I will discuss the reactivation and presentation of various types of documents, as well as the way I focused on reactivating a sort of semi-forgotten local, in that sense Parisian and French memory, that those documents bear witness to. One of the most recent thematic exhibitions that placed at heart of its research and display questions related to the history of conceptual and contemporary art in former Eastern Europe was this exhibition, The Promises of the Past 1950 to 2010, which had a subtitle, A Discontinuous History of Art in the Former Eastern Europe. The exhibition was consciously divided into two main parts, or two complementary exhibition parcours. The first part was co-curated by Christine Massel and Joanna Mitkowska, whom I presume you all know, in Warsaw, so the director of the Museum of Modern Art. And while I will not have the time to go more into the details, technical performance. I just wanted to show you basically some of the display. So the exhibition was divided into two parts, which were both, which were both designed by two artists. So this was the sort of parcours of the artworks, designed by Monika Sosnowska, the Polish artist that very often deals in her installations with the architecture. It was a zigzag structure that, this is the look from the outside, that tried to refer to a sort of disorientating choreography for the visitor, in which there was a linear narrative, so a linear path to go along the structure, but it had this kind of very disorientating pockets into which, with which the Monika Sosnowska wanted to do some kind of reference to the idea of pockets of history, pockets of memory that has not been reactivated in the present, has been semi-forgotten. And in her sense, this was actually being then came out in her proposal for the structure. Through the 7 chapters in this exhibition, they were called Beyond the Modernist Utopias, Fantasies of the Totality, Anti-Art, Private and Public Space, Female Feminist, Micropolitical Gestures and Institutional Critique, and Utopia Revisited, no matter how problematic these chapters could sound and were. The idea was to confront the neo-avant-garde art from the former Eastern Europe, with particular highlight on conceptual art, and by representing the archival objects like artworks, as well as performance documentation, to basically see how the contemporary, so the young generation of the artists that works in former East and former Western Europe, how do they perform a sort of archaeological operation within their practices. For example, if I quote just two, like Deimantas Narkevicius or David Malkovic are, for example, two from this generation that through their own work brings this erased or just really disposed but very important conceptual chapters back to our present consciousness. So the objective of the so I just go through so you have a feeling of how this was. So the objective of the contextual part, which was in another space. So I open to see. The objective, excuse me, the objective of the contextual part was to reveal how theoretical and art historical discourses about former Eastern Europe are in progress, and from a curatorial perspective, how a living archive seemed appropriate, the most appropriate form with which to address this. There were artworks from the group Irvin, so I will talk about maybe if we have some time at the end how the contextual part was designed or conceived. The artworks by the group Irvin that we see here, the film by Deimantas Narkevicius, and then the archives of Pierre Restany, the Paris Biennial, and two particular chapters of a Paris-related events, but run by two ladies coming from the former Eastern Europe. All this was the focus of this contextual part, through which the idea was to highlight whatever was visible in the exhibition parcours, in the main artworks parcours. The contextual part also held a series of film projections and talks, which was really one of the first time that in Centre Pompidou the debates took place in an exhibition. So it was the idea that the discourse has to be brought in the exhibition itself. The design was done by Tobias Putrich, so this all cardboard structures that you see has been done by the Slovene artist who lives in US and who very often deals with the ruins of architecture or the memory of architecture coming from various sources like expressionist architecture, always dealing with cinema. So in this case, in this particular case, he merged two cinema structures, one from Berlin, the Kino International, and the one from Ljubljana, Kino Šiška, which both come from the period, the same period of 60s of the social modernist architecture, and both have a kind of same organization of space. To go back to the idea of the document, one of the first exhibitions that consciously addressed the document and its relation to the performance in the former Eastern Europe was Body and the East, curated by Zdenka Badovinac at Moderna Galeria in Ljubljana. That was in 1998, when Badovinac curated a survey on body art in Eastern Europe and presented an important counter-universalist point about the difference between actions that have been done in the West and in the East of Europe, and that, in her opinion, lay in the observation that similar gestures have different reading in different geopolitical spaces. One later exhibition by the same curator, Zdenka Badovinac, Interrupted Histories, that she done in 2006 in Ljubljana, focused furthermore on archiving as an artistic practice and a mode of what she calls self-historicization. And to name just a few of recent examples as well, where the archive was in the core of curatorial research. There was this ongoing series called Living Archive in the Van Abbe Museum in Eindhoven, which is a sort of juxtaposition of the museum's bibliothèque, the library documents juxtaposing the collection of the museum. And there have been also a lot of smaller scale projects like Invisible History of Exhibitions in Budapest, or a lot of work has been done in juxtaposing the memory coming from forgotten archives in the former Yugoslavia, where there was very interesting important curatorial decision done by several centers from the former Yugoslavia that started to again communicate through bringing together these conceptual practices in something that emerged as a joint project, where cases of student cultural centers in Yugoslavia were addressed, or for example in Novi Sad there was an exhibition taking place also about mapping of the local conceptual art histories. So all this is just to say that there has been really an increasing interest in for younger generation of curators in order to rewrite some chapters in art history from the region that has been done through very engaged curatorial positions. If I go back to the exhibition itself, to the Promises of the Past, there was an interesting commentary about it by the French critic Catherine Millet, who called it, he qualified it in, and the context of this qualification was rather pejorative. She says that it is essentially documentary exhibition, and how incredibly disappointed she was by seeing all those documents and documents and documents of performances and of performances. So it was in Art Press, and all this. All these comments made me think that it was a very important, actually, gesture to think about what actually, in different geographies, the relationship between document and artwork represents. So, in the typology of documents that I tried to address, I will lean on the questions about document and performativity, as was raised in many of writings of American theoretician of performance Philip Auslander, and the way he uses the idea of the mediatized performance and the document that then transmits this performance to somebody who has not attended the original event itself, was for me quite important while devising the many different types of documents and bringing the Parisian past back to the present moment. So Auslander calls basically he termed this idea of liveness and mediatized performance. And as he demonstrated in his writings about the liveness, the ontology of liveness is not produced simply by the presence of a performer. Some performances which contain live presence are, however, highly mediatized, and therefore do not have an ontological live quality and may not be experienced as live in some other understandings of the term. And some works which are entirely technical in their production, he says, should therefore have none of the conventional descriptors of the live, nevertheless do have the ontology and effect of liveness. One way, he says, of interpreting this anomaly is to consider liveness not as a property inherent in certain events and phenomena, definable by reference only to the objective properties of that event, but rather that liveness is a conceptual metaphor which we use to understand a range of different phenomena. The concept liveness clearly does not have a concrete structure and is therefore only capable of being understood via metaphor in terms of more concrete concepts like kinesthetic and embodied experience to provide a scope for elaboration. There is another seminal text to think about the performance documentation that Auslander wrote in 2005 on the performativity of performance documentation, where he references his colleague, the theoretician of performance and body art, Amelia Jones, who in her essay, Presence in Absentia, explores the relationship between performance and document. Reinstating photography's position as an access point to the reality of performance, Jones declared how she is, quote, respectful of the specificity of knowledges gained from participating in a live performance situation. Jones argues that this specificity should not be privileged over the specificity of knowledges that develop in relation to the documentary traces of such an event. While the live situation may enable the phenomenological relations of flesh-to-flesh engagement, the documentary exchange between the viewer-reader and the document is equally intersubjective, says Jones. And following from this argument, Auslander classifies any performance documentations into two categories, the documentary and theatrical. And specifically the theatrical is the one that is interesting for this discussion here, since it represents all the performances that are staged only for the sole purpose of being recorded, and where the original event itself does not bear any preceding existence whatsoever. So Auslander says the space of a document, be it visual or audiovisual, becomes the only space in which the performance takes place. For example, again my bad manipulation, excuse me. I can't see. For example, I just chose 3 cases that were all of them in the exhibition as well. There are 3 crucial pieces from the performance and let's say daily happening from the Eastern Europe. So Sanja Ivejković's work Triangle, or Julius Koller's series of UFO, the Universal Futurological Operations, or Mladen Stilinović artists at work. So they were all pieces done, for example, in 70s, and they were done very often solely for the camera, especially the Mladen Stilinović's work, where we see the artist at work, praising the notion of laziness, but only being represented as a series of black and white photographies. So these are the cases of the theatrical performance documentation. So it is not about capturing reality or situation, but it's the production itself that features in the document, in the work itself. Facing the theatricality, the document's authenticity and its ability to reflect reality is discredited, because the consequence is that the spectator does not see the document as communication of information, but as the staging of information. In the conclusion of this seminal essay, Auslander states that, I quote, the crucial relationship is not the one between the document and the performance, but the one between the document and its audience. Perhaps the authenticity of the performance document resides in its relationship to its beholder, rather than an ostensibly originary event. Perhaps its authority is rather phenomenological than ontological. It may well be that our sense of the presence, power and authenticity of documented performances derives not from the treating the document as an indexical access point to a past event, but from perceiving the document itself as a performance for which we, the spectators, are the present audience. End of quote. So in this idea of reactivation, so what does it happen in the present moment of spectatorship, is something that Auslander continued from drawing from two different theoreticians. So he aligned himself with obviously the Walter Benjamin's concept of reactivation, where Benjamin wrote about how a reproduction reactivates the original. And he quotes Benjamin in order to make this relationship between the performances and the audience more visible. And Benjamin says that the technical reproduction can put the copy of the original into situations which would be out of reach for the original itself. Above all, it enables the original to meet the beholder halfway, be it in the form of a photograph or phonograph record. In permitting the reproduction to meet the beholder or listener in his own particular situation, the technique of reproduction reactivates the object reproduced. And it is especially that Auslander finds intriguing the adjective that Benjamin uses, it's the halfway. So the entropy of this transmission between the document and the beholder is lost on a way. In his most recent essay, Reactivation, Performance Mediatization and the Present Moment, Auslander develops further his theoretical approach to performance documentation, focusing on the phenomenological relation of the public to the performance document, and less on the ontological relation of the document. In his approach, Auslander observes how a spectator's primary action of looking at performance art documentation is not the witnessing of live events, as we said, but the imaginative reconstitution of performances from the images. He draws on the hermeneutics of the German philosopher Hans-Georg Gadamer, and especially his Truth and Method from the 1960s, who argues that understanding something does not consist of revealing an objective truth inherent in it, waiting to be discovered, but rather that this understanding, so the reception process in our terms, proves to be something that emerges through dialogue. In our case, in the case of spectator and performance documentation, it's the dialogue between the performance document and the public. All understanding has a practical orientation in the sense of being determined by our contemporary situation, says Auslander. And therefore, again, this idea that in the moment of us beholding a performance documentation, there is something like a performance in present that is taking place. So I will skip, because I have like 5 minutes left, and I just wanted to basically go through the typology that, okay, I got it. The idea was to, no, sorry, I'm so bad. The idea of the living archive was thus that it's not only the exhibition of performance documentation in the course of the exhibition, but there was also a change of display that we were doing, and that there was a variety of exhibition artifacts that were exhibited and that played themselves with the idea of whether they are artworks or whether they are only documentary evidence. The first, before I showed you the work of Group Irwin, itself has an ambiguous status because it was it's a photography of an existing installation. So through representing the photography as such of an existing installations, they were reaching this moment of questioning the relationship between the two different exhibit issues. And in the central room of this space, there was a changing display of the exhibition activities that took place in Paris in 70s, as I mentioned. One was belonging to the gallery related to Anka Ptaszkowska, whom you probably also know, who live in Warsaw, was the co-founder of Foksal Gallery Foundation, and who later came to Paris, where she established a gallery which had with each event, the gallery got a number, so it was from Gallery 1 to Gallery 36. And we represented actually, she decided to represent Galerie 39, so she coined, she understood the event itself of this exhibition as her, as the Gallery 39, where she came up with one painting. What you see on the left is a painting of an artist that they never exhibited in the gallery during the 70s, and as she kept sort of sentimental about it, because the artist died quite unknown, she sort of felt that the reactivating of the past should be done by exhibiting this painting. And next to it there was in the corner, you see her, it's a kind of an installation that you see maybe in the old train stations, where it was a very interesting understanding of the invitation as artwork itself. All the events of the galleries had an invitation that was marked with a number. So they were Gallery 1 would be, the paper itself would be the exhibition space, basically. So it was not only an invitation, it was artwork in itself. That's the way she understands them. So in the small monitor we had photographs by Eustache Kosakowski, who was documenting through black and white photography all the events happening in the Galerie 1 to 36, and which are in themselves exactly what bridges the mere documentation photography and artistic photography in that sense. Because Kosakowski was not only following the whole avant-garde of Polish avant-garde with his photographs, well-known photographs of Edward Krasiński, but also doing author photography. And next to it, we had the other chapter from the Paris memory, as we called it. It was Galerie des Locataires. So I'll just finish with this. It was Galerie des Locataires, which happened at the same time as the Galerie 1 to 36. And it had another installation. It was actually a mobile curatorial concept by a Croatian art historian who lived in the same time in Paris, and who presented her archive in the frame of an online digitalized archive, as well as reactivated some works from the 70s, like André Caderet. So she would basically, every day we stamped the tickets of André Caderet, which were the reactivation of his action from '74, and where she was the only person who was being legitimized to reactivate this project, and she hasn't reactivated in years. So it was an important action for both ladies and for the Paris memory. This is André Caderet's letter that we also exhibited next to which gives the legitimation to herself to reactivate the piece. And the piece says, it's just to end, because it's also a very nice comment on the document, the paper on which this text is printed on is to be thrown, and the text that you read, it's to be forgotten. However, there is the fact that you have read this text, seen this paper, and this cannot change anything at all. It doesn't give you anything. And this all just contributes to the limit of your power. So I'm sorry for the confusion with the technical performance, but thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Nataša Petrešin Bachelez, for now bringing together two aspects which at first glance seem to exclude each other, the immobility of the archive on the one hand, and the nature of performative or fluxes or whatever are on the other. And of course, from a curatorial perspective, curators, I would say, always bring life into the archives when they turn it into an exhibition. Actually, there is a lot of discussions and actions going on the subject you pointed at. For example, in October in Switzerland, in Basel, there will be a conference on how to archivize performative art. How is it possible to put something into an archive which is moving and evanescent? Or in Norway, the National Library of Norway just published a book edited by Eivind Rossack called The Archive in Motion. So what you hint at with the idea of the performance, the living document, is a very present debate. And I wonder now what our audience will say on whether this exhibition really managed to bring something alive. Was it a living one? But I don't know. Yes.
I would like to ask you about these pockets of history and memory. I liked very much this expression, and I was quite attracted by it. And I would like to ask you who you think should fulfill them. Are perhaps artists and curators more dedicated to do it than historians, or no, or these should be historians or society or?
No, I don't give any privilege to the curatorial work. I mean, that's why I was saying it sounded like an excuse that I'm a curator, but I think that there is much work that is done on this digging out of those practices that are either embedded in the archives that have just recently been accessed, or in the practice, like I mentioned, the contemporary artists that they are researching on their own and bringing these practices back to life and back to the present moment. I think this all goes hand in hand between the whole world of art and the art criticism, and obviously in the theory and history. There are I don't see any hierarchical. I also don't see any point in bringing forward the idea that now it's the new generation of curatorial strategies or whatever that is helping this coming out. What is, however, important to say, I think, is that the exhibitions like this bring certain visibility, or let's say when there is a lot of talk, as we just encounter now, a lot of talk about the archives, bring a certain visibility to a certain artistic strategy that is also at hand. And that through these artistic strategies, then we again reassess the forgotten memories or forgotten history of artistic practices. I don't know if I answer it, but for me it's really not in the curatorial endeavor that this should happen. But I also forgot to, because of running of the time, the very important chapter in the contextual part was also dealing with the archive of Pierre Estany and Paris Biennial. And when I went through the Paris Biennial press archive, which is in Rennes, close to Rennes, there is not one. I didn't find one article that would deal with the presence of Eastern European republics. They were all about the Western European presence, or the US or elsewhere. But this, it's as if non-existence, although when you go through the documents and you see through the catalogs, and I did an extensive work with the help of Didier Schulman, who is here with us, it's amazing how much of this highly important conceptual artists were going through this biennial. and were just non-existent in the eyes of the
Okay, I think we are a bit, after a long morning, a bit exhausted, maybe even a bit hungry. Just to be a bit provocative in the end.
How did it work?
This marvelous exhibition, Promises of the Past, in the Centre Pompidou.
Yeah.
I found it still very archival. I mean, the space, it's an archival space. Why do you say it was performative? How could you, what is performative about this?
The performative was the idea, the idea that I use as performative document is that it actually enables your, the spectator to come into touch with what happened in a performance or in an event, that this is the performative way. That goes back to also to the notion of performativity in Austin, or in some ways to Judith Butler, but the performativity as a process of reactivating the past. That was the idea of the performative potential of the document.
Yeah. John, it's more of a comment, and picking up on this question of the how to archive the living performance. And the thought goes through my head that of course also poses enormous questions for conservation. And it's striking that conservators are the interlocutor that's not so much present in this discussion that happens between theorists and curators and artists, and yet the very questions raised by the questions you're exploring in analyzing this exhibition, the Promise of the Past, also stage the necessity of bringing conservation into that question, since there the issues are posed at their most pressing and poignant. And it's noticeable that they're not part of this theoretical discussion.
You mean as a conservation, as a, okay, in the museums, yes.
Because it raises issues about the
absolutely, yeah, I agree. Well, it's that's maybe where I will not accuse myself, but that's maybe also the point where this sort of independent curatorial activities have to merge with the conservation, the museum studies activities, where I think in my generation I've seen a lot of gaps, and have actually this dealing with the performance documentation might bring, and it's already bringing, as you mentioned, a lot of insight into how to conserve a performance in the museums. So, but in our case, at least in the exhibition, it was not really, there was not, the highlight was not on the performance itself. It was really about the different types of documents taken from the archives, and how they enable to represent a past experience.
Okay, now the very last question after a very rich morning. No? Not. Okay, then I say thank you both to the speakers and to the audience for a very rich morning. Thank you very much.